I thought I understood the boundaries between life and death, between consciousness and oblivion. Then I met Gary Dockery. For years I told his family he likely couldn't understand us. For years I trusted the EEGs, the reflex tests, the data. But one winter morning, Gary proved me wrong in the most unnerving way possible, and the look in his eyes when he realized how much time had passed. I'll never forget that moment for as long as I live. What happens inside a mind when 1/5 of its brain is destroyed? In medicine, we can measure tissue loss on a scan. We can map which functions are handled by which regions, but we can't see the thoughts, the flickers of self that might survive. I'd been trained to think in terms of probability. Damage in certain areas meant certain losses. That belief would be challenged by an officer named Gary Dockery, but in 1988 all I knew was the story of how he was injured. It was a September morning in Walden, Tennessee, a small town where calls for help rarely involved weapons. Gary was responding to a disturbance. He parked his patrol car, stepped out, and approached the address. What happened next was over in a fraction of a second. A man emerged from the doorway with a gun and fired at point-blank range. The bullet entered Gary's forehead just above his right eye. The kinetic energy drove fragments of metal and bone deep into his brain tissue. He dropped instantly. Paramedics transported him under lights and sirens to the nearest facility, able to handle penetrating head trauma. By the time he reached the operating room, his intracranial pressure was dangerously high. Neurotrauma surgeons made the decision to remove a section of his frontal lobe where the damage was most severe, but the bullet had shattered. Not all of it could be retrieved. Tiny fragments remained embedded near critical blood vessels. Attempting to remove them would have caused more destruction. The team stabilized him, but the injury was catastrophic. When he left the acute care unit weeks later, Gary did not follow commands. His eyes could open, but he produced no speech. Any movement of his limbs was reflexive. The term on his chart was persistent vegetative state, awake in a biological sense, but without evidence of conscious awareness. At that time, I was in my earlier years as a neurologist and had been called in to evaluate cases like his. The tools we relied on were limited. Bedside exams, checking for purposeful movement, testing cranial nerve responses, and ordering EEGs to see if there were any signs of cortical activity that matched environmental stimuli. In PVS patients, you might see sleep-wake cycles on an EEG, but no brainwave changes when you spoke to them or touched their hand. That was the pattern Gary showed. The prognosis for recovery after a year in that state was close to zero. That was reflected in both the medical literature and in how physicians approached these cases. Families were told in plain language that time was not their ally. For many, the situation became a prolonged vigil, years of visits, talking to someone who never replied, and decisions about long-term care that never seemed to get easier. Gary's relatives didn't see him as gone. His brother often insisted he could tell when Gary was listening, that certain blinks meant yes and others meant no. More than once, they described moments they thought were emotional reactions: a tear when someone told a sad story, a faint smile when a friend recounted something funny from the police department. I knew how easy it was to see patterns in random reflexes. Still, I always noted their observations in the chart. This tension between objective measurement and human intuition is part of neurology. I've worked long enough to recognize that while science has clear rules for what counts as evidence, families live in a different space. They notice what we might overlook. But in those years after the shooting, every exam reinforced the diagnosis: no purposeful movement, no consistent response to any specific stimulus, no speech. From 1988 through the early 90s, my interactions with Gary followed that same pattern. His body kept its rhythms, eyes opening and closing through the day, limbs occasionally moving. His vitals were stable. The years passed without any sign he would return to cognitive life. When you see that over time, you start believing the door is locked permanently. And yet, I sometimes wondered about him when I left the facility at the end of the day. Was there truly nothing behind that gaze, or had the injury walled his mind off from his own body? That question didn't change the exams I documented, but it lingered. Then came February of 1996. Gary had been in that silent state for over 7 years. I had no reason to think the next time I was called to his bedside would be any different from the dozens before. I could never have predicted what was about to happen. How do you measure 7 years in a life you can't hear or see expressed, when your patient never speaks, never follows a command, and the only movements you witness are slow blinks or the flex of a hand that doesn't happen in response to anything you've done? The days blur together. For me, as Gary's neurologist during that period, the clock was kept not by changes in his condition, but by scheduled evaluations and the calendar notes in his file. Gary's state looked the same year after year. His eyes would open in the morning and close at night, though not always in sync with the sun. Sometimes they would stay partially open for hours, the gaze unfocused, pupils reacting normally to light, but not tracking movement in the room. Every so often a hand would squeeze over mine, but never predictably, once during a blood pressure check, another time while I was adjusting his pillow. Without a pattern, it was considered reflex, part of the baseline brainstem activity that persisted despite the damage. The challenge was always the same, distinguishing between reflexive behavior and intentional action. Clinically, intention means reproducibility. It means that if you say, "Squeeze my hand," you get the same deliberate movement most of the time, not once in a while by coincidence. Over the years, we tried different approaches, asking him to blink twice for yes, to look toward me for no. There was never a reliable response rate. He'd blink, but not in a repeatable sequence. He'd look away when spoken to, but the timing seemed random. EEG studies offered no new clarity. They showed a preserved sleep-wake cycle, which was common in persistent vegetative state. But when we introduced stimuli, spoken phrases, a light flash, even mild tactile prompts, there was no cortical reactivity, no impulse patterns suggesting awareness or recognition. These were not brief tests either. We'd monitor him for hours at a time. The readings never changed in a way that pointed toward conscious processing. His family, though, sometimes told me different stories. His brother swore that when asked a question, Gary would give blinks that matched the answer. They'd insist he smiled when someone made a certain joke or teared up at news of a tragedy involving someone he knew. I understood why they would see meaning in these moments. When you visit daily, you search for signs of the person you remember. I would caution them that involuntary expressions could be part of the injury's pattern. What they saw as willful might only be coincidental muscle activation. Over time, the divide between their perception and my clinical assessment became its own quiet weight in the room. They came with hope. I had to approach with detachment. If I allowed myself to share their optimism openly, I risked blurring the line between medical evidence and emotional interpretation. My role was to describe what we could prove, not what we wanted to believe. I knew this could make me seem cold, but in neurology, especially with chronic disorders of consciousness, that distance can keep decisions grounded. Statistics were on the side of my skepticism. Recovery of meaningful neurological function after more than 12 months in a vegetative state, particularly from a penetrating brain injury, is almost non-existent. The literature reflects case reports more than trends. 7 years without change was not just beyond the curve, it was essentially off the scale. In training and in practice, we're taught not to hold a prognosis open indefinitely for something that hasn't happened in nearly a decade. But Gary's brother remained convinced. In the hallway after my exams, he'd tell me he could read Gary better than any of us. He'd known him his whole life. He felt sure that somewhere under that still expression, his brother's mind was intact, hearing every word, cataloging every visit. I didn't argue the point beyond explaining what the tests showed. We operated from different frameworks, his rooted in lifelong familiarity, mine in neurology's current definitions and limits. That tension never resolved. I would leave each visit thinking about how two people could stand over the same bed and see something so different. One saw a silent body sustaining life and nothing more. The other saw a hidden presence held captive by injury. For 7.5 years, nothing shifted to close that gap. Until the morning things changed, not from a new therapy, not from a neurological discovery, but from a complication no one welcomed. It began with a fever. In neurology, an infection in a patient with a persistent vegetative state is always a crisis, but it's a crisis for the body. You worry about lungs filling with fluid, dropping oxygen levels, septic shock. You don't expect it to touch the mind. The brain in those cases has been damaged for years. An infection doesn't reverse that. At least that's what I believed on the night of February 10th, 1996. It started with a low-grade fever the nursing staff noticed on their evening rounds. By the next morning, the fever was higher and his breathing was faster. A chest x-ray showed what we expected, patchy infiltrates in the right lung consistent with pneumonia. In patients like Gary, pneumonia was a familiar and dangerous enemy. He couldn't cough effectively, he couldn't reposition himself without help, and his swallow reflex was impaired. Any of those can lead to fluid or bacteria pooling in the lungs. The decision point was straightforward on paper, but difficult in reality. With a patient who's been unresponsive for over 7 years, you have to decide whether to treat aggressively or focus on comfort. Aggressive treatment means antibiotics, frequent suctioning, IV fluids, possibly oxygen masks or intubation. Comfort care means keeping him pain-free and allowing the infection to take its natural course. It was not a decision for me alone, it was one for his family after they understood what each path meant. I sat with his brother in the small family room off the ward. I explained his current condition and the odds. I told him the pneumonia could end Gary's life in days, even hours, if left untreated. I told him that no infection had ever, in my experience or in the literature I knew, led to neurological recovery. In a case like Gary's, the odds of him regaining awareness were not just low, they were vanishingly close to zero. Treating him wouldn't change that. It would simply keep his body going if the antibiotics worked. His brother didn't hesitate. He wanted full treatment. I signed the orders that night. We started broad-spectrum intravenous antibiotics to target the most likely bacteria. We placed him on supplemental oxygen to ease his breathing. Acetaminophen brought his fever down a little, though it still hovered well above normal. Nurses elevated the head of his bed to help his lungs drain, changed his position every 2 hours, and monitored his saturation. I checked in at intervals, but nothing about his neurological state was different from the dozens of times I'd examined him before. The night of February 11th was quiet in the ward. Most rooms were dark except for the glows of monitors. Respiratory therapy came through at regular intervals to clear his airway. His fever peaked a little after midnight, then started to fall slowly toward morning. I wrote my early progress note and planned to see him again after morning rounds. There was nothing to suggest that anything beyond the infection was changing. Around 4 a.m. on February 12th, my phone rang. I was at my desk reviewing another patient's chart. It was one of the nurses from Gary's unit. She didn't sound rushed or alarmed, just insistent. She said very plainly, "He's awake." I started to tell her that his eyes were often open. She stopped me and added, "He's awake and talking." There was no noise of commotion behind her, just the steadiness in her voice that made me set the phone down, pick up my coat, and head for the ward without another word. As I walked down the corridor toward his room, the rest of the hospital was still. The kind of stillness you get only before dawn, when shift changes are an hour away, and even the constant hum of activity in a medical center has settled into a lull. My mind was already listing possible explanations: confusion from fever, random vocalizations the family might be interpreting as speech. But I'd never known him to vocalize more than a grunt in all the years I'd followed him. When I reached the door, I could hear voices from inside, not a nurse giving report, not the family talking over him. A man's voice, clear, steady, with the rhythm of someone carrying on a normal conversation. It stopped me for a second. I knew that voice from recordings and family videos they'd shown me in the early days. I stepped in, and there was Gary looking right at the person speaking to him, mouth moving in full sentences, as if the last 7.5 years had never happened. Imagine walking into a room expecting the same stillness you've seen for years and hearing a voice you haven't heard in nearly a decade. That was the moment I stepped into Gary Dockery's room at just after 4 a.m. He was propped up slightly in bed, eyes tracking me, posture engaged, and before I even spoke, he said, "Are you Dr. Kaplan?" The sound of it stopped me cold. It wasn't mumbled or distorted. It was the clear speech of a man addressing me directly. I stepped to his bedside, still processing the reality of it. I told him who I was, and without prompting, he said he knew he was in a hospital and that he was being treated for pneumonia. He glanced around, seemed to be taking the room in, and there was no sign of the blank stare I had grown used to. Instead, he met my gaze, waited for responses, and spoke with the timing of someone used to normal conversation. I asked him simple orientation questions first. His answers were immediate. Then I moved to personal history. He told me about his years working as a police officer, naming the town without hesitation. He named fellow officers I had never met but recognized from his records. He spoke about the horses he had as a child, down to their names and colors. Every detail fit with information I knew from his family or from archived reports. There was no confabulation, no vagueness, none of the slippage you often hear in patients recovering from long unconsciousness. What struck me next was his humor. At one point, when I asked him to remember a series of numbers, he said, "You're still testing me. Guess not much has changed." He smirked when someone mentioned his brother, making a comment about how he hoped he wasn't in trouble. His tone carried sarcasm and emotional nuance. These weren't rote answers from muscle memory, they were expressions of personality. As a neurologist, a part of my mind was still running checklists. Was this possible delirium from resolving infection? Unlikely, given the coherence. Was there any sign of aphasia or word-finding difficulty? None that I could detect. He handled multi-step commands. He could do mental math when I asked, adding and subtracting 2-digit numbers in his head without delay. Late in the morning, I decided to tell him the truth about how much time had passed. I told him it wasn't 1988 anymore. I told him it had been over 7 years since the injury. He went silent for a moment, eyes fixed ahead. He didn't cry or become angry, at least not outwardly, but the pause was weighted. He gave a slow nod, then looked at his brother and asked a quiet question about the department. The conversation shifted after that, softer but still steady. By midday, the room was no longer quiet. Word had spread quickly. Family members, some who hadn't heard his voice in years, began arriving. The reunion was unlike anything I'd seen in my career. He recognized them all. There were laughs, stories, and more than once I saw someone scan his face in disbelief as they listened to him. Nurses came in between tasks just to witness it. Even those who had worked with him for years and never heard a word were suddenly leaning in to hear him talk about things that had happened before the injury, as if no time had passed at all. His energy through the day was remarkable given his illness. He conversed without signs of fatigue, answered every question, initiated some on his own. Not once during that 18-hour stretch did I see the awareness fade or waver. It didn't build gradually that morning, and it didn't ebb away through the day. It had appeared fully, as if some locked mechanism had suddenly released. That night, when visiting hours ended and the lights in the corridor dimmed, he was still speaking in complete sentences. None of us knew how long it would last. I left the hospital with the sound of his voice still playing in my head, and a quiet unease I couldn't explain. By the next morning, the change we had all witnessed would begin to shift again without warning. The mind had reignited, but no one knew how long the light would last. By the next morning, the difference was still remarkable at first glance. Gary greeted me, answered when spoken to, and recognized his brother, but the pace was slower. Instead of the easy back and forth from the day before, his replies took longer to form. The elaborate stories and vivid recollections had given way to shorter statements. He still knew where he was, but his questions were less spontaneous. Later that day, the change was a little more pronounced. He began to favor yes or no answers over full sentences. I would ask about a specific person, and he'd nod. When I followed with an open-ended question, he'd look thoughtful for a moment, then say a single word. Once or twice, he drifted into silence mid-conversation, eyes still open, but no longer focused in the same way. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was like watching an image slowly lose clarity until only the outline remained. The nurses noticed, too. Word had spread quickly about his awakening, so staff had been stopping in just to talk to him. That second day, some emerged from his room with mixed expressions. They were still encouraged that he responded, but less certain about what they were witnessing. The liveliness of his jokes and the quick recognition from the day before weren't as sharp. His brother stayed at his side almost constantly, leaning in when Gary spoke, sometimes repeating questions to give him another chance to answer. By Wednesday, the regression was clearer. His speech was concise, often limited to a single phrase. Yes, no, don't know. Sometimes he would shrug instead of answering with words. He still recognized his brother and certain staff members, but didn't initiate conversation on his own. I checked the usual neurological indicators, pupil responses, basic motor testing, and they were unchanged from before the awakening. What was slipping away wasn't function in the sense of reflexes or motor output. It was the presence behind the words. The family's mood shifted. The first day had been filled with joy and disbelief, the second with a careful optimism. By the third, you could see the hesitation in their faces before they interpreted a response as meaningful. They understood he was still more interactive than he had been for years, but they were watching that brief return to the man they knew slipping away. When you've held on to hope for so long and finally see it fulfilled, even partially, watching the reversal feels heavier than the years of silence before it. Thursday morning brought a new concern. He was scheduled for lung surgery to help address damage from the pneumonia, removing infected tissue and improving his breathing. We discussed the risks, including that anesthesia could affect brain activity. However, his oxygenation and infection control depended on the procedure, so the decision stood. He was prepped and taken to the operating room just after sunrise. From a neurologist's perspective, anesthesia in a case like Gary's is tricky. His brain had long established injury patterns. Whatever fragile balance had enabled him to regain speech even briefly might not withstand the suppression of neural activity that comes with general anesthesia. But there was no way to predict the degree of that risk or whether it would matter at all. The surgery itself went as planned, with no major complications. Post-operatively, he was drowsy, which was expected, but as the hours passed and sedation should have worn off, his responses remained inconsistent. When asked who was in the room, he sometimes answered correctly and sometimes said nothing at all. A few times he nodded when addressed, but most of the time there was no reaction. His speech, when it returned, was a fraction of what it had been 2 days earlier. That 18-hour window of full alertness seemed closed. Sitting next to his bed that afternoon, I kept turning through the possibilities in my mind. Was his awakening the result of some extraordinary temporary alignment of neurological pathways, a byproduct of the fever and the physiological stress of fighting pneumonia, briefly reactivating circuits dormant for years? We had no test to confirm it, no clear trigger that could be repeated. Whatever had happened, it had been fragile, and now it was gone. By the evening, both family and staff had settled into a quieter acceptance. There was no dramatic collapse, no sudden loss, just a steady return to the silence that had defined his life since the injury. None of us could say for certain why it came or why it left, but we all knew the extraordinary day we'd witnessed would not happen again. And for me, the questions it raised would not fade. When science fails to explain what you've seen with your own eyes, the questions have a way of outlasting the answers. For months after Gary's awakening, I tried to unpick the sequence. I paged through every note, reviewed every lab, tracked every dose of every medication. If there was a combination of treatments, environmental factors, or physiological stresses that brought him back, I wanted to find it. We repeated some of the drugs he'd been on during those hours, antibiotics, fever reducers, even the exact oxygen settings. Nothing changed, no spark came back. That was the point when the weight of it began to turn. If the cause couldn't be reproduced, then maybe I had to accept that there are events in neurology that don't fit into the pathways we chart on diagrams. And if that was true, what else about our evaluations might be missing? Could patients I was calling unresponsive still be aware in some hidden, inaccessible way? The idea was unsettling in a way I hadn't experienced in my career. We rely on what we can measure, reflexes, EEG changes, imaging, and when those show nothing, we call the mind absent. But Gary had shown me that absence on paper doesn't always mean absence in reality. I turned over every theory I could think of. The fever could have altered his brain chemistry in just the right way, briefly restoring communication within surviving neural networks, or perhaps the stress response, flooding his system with hormones and neurotransmitters, had reactivated dormant circuits that found new paths around the damage. Then there was the idea I kept returning to late at night, that maybe Gary had been absorbing more than we thought those 7 years, listening from behind a barrier he couldn't control, and that something in those hours tore that barrier down for just long enough. Those possibilities left me uneasy, not just as a physician, but as someone responsible for guiding families through the hardest decisions of their lives. If there's a chance, no matter how small, that a person in a vegetative state can perceive you, even without showing it, how should that change the way we treat them? Do we talk to them as if they're present? Make sure they have stimulation, conversation, familiarity every day? And how do we counsel families knowing there's a possible layer we can't confirm? It's one thing to wrestle with that in private. It's another to face it in a room where a family is asking if their loved one can hear them. Before Gary, my answer relied on evidence. There's no sign of that. After Gary, I found myself leaving more space in my response. I'd tell them what the tests showed, but I also acknowledged that there might be limits to what those tests could see. I started paying more attention to the details families noticed, the subtle expressions, the coincidental timing of a movement after a question, things I used to discount as chance. In the broader field, cases like Gary's began pushing more interest in advanced imaging. Functional MRI could show brain areas activating even when a patient didn't move or speak. Subtle EEG responsiveness might hint at recognition or processing that's otherwise hidden. These were tools that could one day help separate true absence of awareness from a mind trapped in a body that can't respond. But even those technologies come with interpretation problems. Activity doesn't always equal conscious thought. There are risks in reading too much into a pattern, just as there are in missing it completely. For me, the problem wasn't just diagnostic, it was philosophical. Our working definitions of life, of consciousness, of awareness, they all rest on thresholds of function. But Gary's 18 hours forced me to see how narrow and incomplete those thresholds might be. That realization didn't just change how I practiced, it chipped away at my confidence in the framework I'd built my career on. Eventually, the strain of that uncertainty wore me down. I couldn't walk into another room with a patient in a long-term unresponsive state without wondering what I might be missing. And I couldn't risk giving a family false clarity when I was no longer sure of it myself. In the end, I left neurology altogether. People sometimes assume it was because of what I saw in those 18 hours, but the truth is, it was because of the possibility of the 7.5 years before them, the chance that Gary might have been there all along, silent, aware, and waiting behind a door none of us knew how to open. Gary Dockery's 18 hours awake weren't just extraordinary, they force a question we can't ignore. How much might the unresponsive still perceive? We measure what we can, but our tools may miss what's quietly happening behind unchanging eyes. The most important lesson from Gary's case may not be medical or scientific, but deeply human. That awareness changes how you look at every patient lying silent in a bed. It reminds you to speak to them, not over them. Sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are not what the brain has lost, but what it has been holding on to in the dark.